In this video, we're going to talk about the energy for contraction and how we get that energy. How do we have enough energy to do all the things that we need to do? And of course, you know I'm talking about, that's right, ATP. All right, so let's look at something interesting here. Rigor mortis is often called the stiffness of death. So within a few hours after your heart stops beating, your ATP levels in your skeletal muscle, it's exhausted. You've used it all up. So the sarcoplasmic reticulum loses its ability to get the calcium from the sarcoplasm back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum because it requires calcium pumps. And a pump requires what? Energy. Exactly. So if we have no ATP, the calcium pumps cannot function. Now, think about the importance of that. If we can't get calcium out of the sarcoplasm of the cell, then it's going to stay there bound to troponin, which means tropomyosin is off the binding sites, which means actin and myosin have hooked up. Well, guess what else ATP is used for? Think back to what we just talked about. ATP binds to the myosin head to break the cross bridge, so it falls off the actin. Well, if there's no ATP because our heart stopped beating and we're not pumping oxygenated blood out to use the oxygen in our making of ATP, then what happens? The myosin heads can't detach. Therefore, your skeletal muscles are locked in a contracted position and the body becomes rigid. Again, this is known as rigor mortis. It continues for somewhere around 15 to 24 hours depending on the conditions. Now, it does gradually disappear because there are lysosomal enzymes that will be released within the muscle fibers. That causes autolysis or self-destruction of those myofibrils. Now, forensic pathologists can use the development and resolution, or undoing, if you will, of rigor mortis to establish an approximate time of death. So resolution means rigor mortis has ended and the body goes back to not being stiff. So there's a number of factors, though, that can affect that. So environmental conditions have to be taken into account. Where is the body? Is it outside in the sun? Is it in a freezer? Is it at ambient or room temperature? So a warmer body will develop and resolve rigor mortis very quickly because of the increased temperature. A body in the cold will develop and resolve rigor mortis less quickly. So you do have to take in that surrounding temperature and to determine if it's in normal range or not, and if not, how does that affect the establishment of time of death. So within about less than 3 hours of death, the body is still warm with no stiffness. And you can see as the time increases, body temperature is dropping, stiffness is developing. Within 8 to 24, the body should be the same temperature as the room if in normal conditions. The body is stiff, but resolution has begun, and then within 24 to 36 hours, temperature should not change, but the stiffness should decrease until the body is no longer in rigor mortis. As we start looking at how we get the ATP that we need for muscle contraction, let's talk again about the role of ATP. So from what we have discussed already, you should realize there are 3 important roles for ATP in muscle contraction. Let's think back to that cross bridge. In order for the myosin head to get into the cocked position, it has to hydrolyze or break down 1 ATP. Now, once the cross bridge is formed, it takes another ATP to break the cross bridge, right? Then that same ATP gets hydrolyzed to put it back into the cocked position. So that's 2 ATP already for each myosin head. 1 to get it into the cocked position, 2 to break the cross bridge. But there is a lot of ATP that's going to be needed to pump that calcium out of the sarcoplasm and back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So the 3 roles for ATP and muscle contraction: cock the myosin head, break the cross bridge, activate, and provide the energy for the calcium pumps. As I was preparing to record this lecture, I was looking through the textbook, and this number just absolutely blows my mind. So your textbook states that most of the ATP required by skeletal muscle is used to reset those myosin heads, okay? That is up to 2,500 ATP molecules per myosin filament. You ready for this? Per second. Yeah, 2,500 ATP molecules per myosin filament per second. Yeah, I guess we better get to making some ATP. Our muscle cells only store a little bit of ATP, and we use that up in about 5 seconds of intense exertion. So one thing we can do is steal some. So we can take an ADP that's already lost 1 phosphate and steal another phosphate. Well, that's going to turn this into adenosine monophosphate, right? 1 phosphate. And we can take that 1 phosphate that we stole from it and hook it onto another ADP to make ATP. Well, that's not going to give us much, and it's not going to last long. So only, again, another 5 seconds or so of energy. But we do have 3 additional ways to generate ATP, and that is using creatine phosphate, glycolysis, and cellular respiration. Yeah, you know we're going to have to go back and visit cell respiration from chapter 3 for just a second. One way that we can make additional ATP for skeletal muscle metabolism is to steal a phosphate again. So not only do we steal phosphates from ADPs to make ATP, we can steal phosphates from this high energy bond that forms between creatine and phosphate, which makes creatine phosphate, okay? Now, we can steal that phosphate and turn creatine phosphate into creatine, hook that phosphate on an ADP, and boom, easy peasy ATP. So that is catalyzed by an enzyme called creatine kinase, and even though it's all great, it only gives us 1 ATP per creatine phosphate. Well, that's only going to supply us with about 10 to 15 minutes of additional energy. That didn't help much, huh? Nope. Well, let's try some glycolysis then. What do you remember about glycolysis? Oh, I see the wheels turning. This is the first step of cell respiration, right? But it doesn't require oxygen. We use the glucose, and we convert it into 2 pyruvate molecules. And in the process, remember, we net 2 ATPs, okay? So because we didn't have oxygen and we didn't go through the Krebs cycle in the electron transport chain, it's just glycolysis. We actually make 4 ATP, but remember we had to spend 2 to start the process. So with glycolysis, we net 2 ATP. Because this is much quicker than cellular respiration, ATP is produced much more quickly. So this is useful for when we need short bursts of maximum energy, such as if we're running a 100-meter dash. Not going to sustain us for a long time, but we get that initial rush, if you will, of ATP. Aerobic respiration, remember, occurs in the mitochondria, and it requires oxygen. So where's the oxygen come from? Well, we know that we carry oxygen in the blood, right? So we get oxygen from the blood or released from myoglobin, as we talked about in a previous lecture early in this chapter. So myoglobin stores oxygen in muscle cells. Well, that's all well and good. We've got the oxygen, but this is slow. So even though it takes much longer for cellular respiration to occur and produce that ATP, we produce many more ATP. We produce many more ATP molecules with aerobic respiration. So let's just quickly think back about this. So during glycolysis, we break that glucose molecule down. We net a couple of ATPs, okay? Now, that's anaerobic respiration. Oxygen not required. It's happening in the cytosol. But if we want to make enough ATP to really fuel our bodies, it requires the oxygen-using process of aerobic respiration in the mitochondria. So glycolysis results in pyruvate. So some of that is going to be oxidized into and release carbon dioxide, but then we transfer electrons and hydrogen ions, remember, into the FAD and NAD carriers. In my lecture, remember, that's what we called suitcases. We pack the hydrogen ions and the electrons in the suitcase, take them to our destination, which is, right, the electron transport chain. Okay, that's where we unpack those and use that energy to power the pumps and create all of the ATP in the electron transport chain. Now, we can also use triglycerides as a fuel to make ATP, and we make more from triglycerides that have long fatty acid chains. So let's think again. How do we get the energy for muscle metabolism? We convert ADPs to AMPs and take that phosphate and hook it on an ADP. Short term, not a lot of ATP. We steal a phosphate from creatine. Short term, 1 ATP. Glycolysis, break down glucose, 2 ATPs. Cellular respiration, 30-ish ATPs. So this is what we need to do when higher amounts of energy are required for longer and more moderate levels of activity, such as if you're going out for a jog or a run. You're going to use more ATP, therefore you're going to be undergoing more aerobic respiration to replace what you are using. All right, so quick recap there. In the muscles, we can steal a phosphate, even though it's not showing it here. Oh yeah, here it is. We can steal a phosphate from an ADP, hook it up to an ATP. So we took one from one of these, added it to the other one. That gave us 1 ATP and 1 AMP. Remember, mono means one. So let's look at this. How many phosphates? Di and di. 1, 2, 3, 4. Tri, 3. Mono, 1. So we still have 4 phosphates. We just moved them from over here to over here. All right. The other way that we can do this in active muscle is, let's steal a creatine. Boom. We can do that in resting muscle. We can take that creatine off ATP, hook it up to, or take the phosphate off the ATP, hook it up to a creatine, and we go back to ADP and creatine phosphate. So we just put it back into a storage molecule because we weren't actively using it. So here we're making ATP, here we're breaking ATP to store that phosphate. So not a lot being created. Now, in glycolysis, oxygen not required either. Rapid production, but very little ATP. What do we use? Glucose. Aerobic respiration, oxygen is required. It's slower than glycolysis, but makes much more ATP. Well, what do we use? The pyruvates that we made back over here in glycolysis. Okay? All right. Now, again, back to chapter 3. When oxygen is not present, we cannot enter the Krebs cycle, right? So we stop all of this production of ATP at glycolysis. Well, some of that pyruvic acid is going to be made from the pyruvates. Or we're going to convert the pyruvic acid into lactic acid. Okay, so when oxygen is not present, pyruvate is converted to lactate by an enzyme called lactate dehydrogenase. That lactate then can be used by skeletal muscle. And how is that skeletal muscle going to use it? It can enter the muscle mitochondria and be converted back to pyruvate, which can be oxidized into CO2 through cell respiration, or it can leave the skeletal muscle and enter the blood. So lactate that gets into the blood can either be used by cardiac muscle, and we can convert it back to pyruvate and oxidize it, or taken into the liver to be converted to glucose. Glucose then can be released into the blood, taken back into the skeletal muscle, and the skeletal muscle can then use it to make ATP. So we typically use all of these mechanisms to generate ATP depending on the body's needs. Obviously, the more intense our movement, exercise, or whatever, the more ATP we are using, therefore the more we need to make. So if you look at this little graphic here, we've got this lady here in the green shirt, okay? And she is simply doing a 50-meter sprint. So about 10 seconds or less is all the energy she's going to need. So we can supply that much energy by simply transferring those phosphates from an ADP or a creatine phosphate. For this one, the gentleman running this 400-meter sprint, well, it's going to take him about a minute, 50 to 60 seconds. He's going to need more ATP. So we're going to do the transfer first and then glycolysis to give him a little more energy after those first few seconds, okay? Now, this fella is going to run the entire 1,500-meter track. So first, we're going to transfer phosphates, then use glycolysis, then aerobic respiration for the longer endurance requiring more ATP. All right, just a quick look at oxygen debt. So when you're doing an exercise or something that your demand for oxygen exceeds the availability of oxygen, we incur oxygen debt. So that's simply the amount of oxygen consumed after exercise to restore you back to the pre-exercise condition. Well, what's it all about? Why do we need the additional oxygen? Well, skeletal muscles have to replace the oxygen on the myoglobin molecules, replenish the ATP, replenish the creatine phosphate, and replace the glycogen storage that we had. Your liver cells are going to convert lactate back to glucose through gluconeogenesis. Well, that requires oxygen. So when you see somebody sitting around after exercise and they are breathing so hard, that's when you think they are repaying their oxygen debt.